security. I don't think that the first speaker needs much introduction. I'm sure you're all very familiar with John Curran and his ARIN and ServerVault roles. He tells me he's speaking in a personal capacity today, so I will hand you over to John.
Thank you. Okay, good morning everyone. This is pretty simple stuff. It's not rocket science. I'm going to talk about an RFC. It's an now an informational RFC. This is an individual publication. I wrote this and had it published by the IETF. You can actually do that. The IETF will publish things outside of a working group entirely to try to talk about coordination of this upcoming transition for IPv6. Here's the problem statement. We have the entire world trying to figure out how to move to V6. And everyone's got their own timeline. Everyone's got their own schedule. And there's no standard way of communicating how ready you are. And there's a great probability of mismatched expectations. You're thinking V6 is pilot, and someone calls up and says, hey, how come this website's down, or how come this router's down? The problem here is that this doesn't bode well for us. It doesn't show particularly well to the international community. You run into folks like regulators and government leaders who ask the question, what's the plan? Okay? And rightfully so, if you think about what's riding on the internet. We've got the economy, a big piece of the global economy riding on the internet, and people in public policy positions want to know there's a plan, right? We're not just making it up as we go. Well, the problem is, there isn't a plan. There's also no body that can create a plan. There's no one with the authority to call the question and say, okay, this is the official plan. And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, this is a really bad situation, because policy folks and governments and regulators, in the absence of a plan and the organization, will fill one in themselves. They'll make one up for you. So what I've created is effectively a default plan, which says, if you don't tell the world what your transition plan is, don't be surprised if the world says, well, maybe you're following this RFC. Now, you can communicate your own transition plan, you run your own organizations, but in the absence of anything else, it's really convenient to point to a default set of conditions that might occur during this transition. So I authored this, threw it into the IETF, where it's a little bit of a hot potato, obviously, because the IETF recognizes it wasn't in a position to call the question, but they're more than willing to publish things with a clear disclaimer that says, hey, we just published this. It's not our work. It's not any IETF work. So this officially has no status whatsoever. It's just a document. I sort of said this. No one has the ability to establish a global schedule. But we kind of know there is one, folks. We really do. There's a few people in the room who are saying, I'm going to skip IPv6 altogether. If you're one of those people right now, I got good news. You can continue your break outside. Okay? There's coffee. There's still cookies. Take a walk. Have fun. For the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to say anything relevant to you. But if you do believe we're actually going to transition to V6, then, yeah, there is a timeline for it. The timeline is kind of automatic. It's based on your favorite depletion curves. You can go find them. Mr. Houston is around here somewhere. His website's one. Though there's actually some other cool websites that let you change your assumptions and do your own calculations. So we know this is going to happen. Depending on what you read now, the RIRs are not going to be in a position to give IPv4 blocks out to ISPs somewhere in the next 18 to 36 months, depending on what set of assumptions you use and what region you're in and a whole bunch of other things. In 18 months, you have a good chance of going to an RIR and saying, I need my next block, and having them say, don't have any. So whether we like it or not, that sort of sets some timeline here. So here's what I put together. I said, look, we're going to have a three-phase approach. Right now, there are some people who think IPv6 is production. I'm not sure I consider it production right now, because I can call up a lot of internet NOCs and say, hey, I need help with this, and they say, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's two guys who know V6, and I think they're out at Nanog this week, and you can't even get a ticket open. There's no way to report a V6 problem. The team that's running it has no tools to do the job. So I'm not sure I believe we're really production. So we're in a preparation phase. We're going to be in a transition phase, which is the really cool one, guys. This is where some people are moving and some aren't, and the expectations are variable between parties. That's a really interesting state. And then there's post-transition, where folks, if you're announcing a v6 route or if you have a quad A, you really got to support it. I mean, we have to at some point get to the point where commercial traffic can be supported in production and really has to be considered that. So those are the expectations that are going to change over time. It's completely voluntary. You can set your own schedule. You say, John, I don't like your schedule. Your schedule's too soon, too late, too soon. We have to get this done earlier. We can't possibly get it done in time. Great. Why don't you tell people, your peers, why don't you tell your customers what your timeline is? But if you don't publish a plan, do not be surprised if someone asks you, are you following an RFC 5211 plan? Because there's going to be people, there's going to be regulators, there's going to be folks who approve licenses for telecommunication carriers. I know there's going to be some people who are involved in things like taxation and regulation who are going to say, hey, I think you must be following that plan. So to the extent that you're an ISP and you don't have a communicated schedule, please don't be surprised with the fact that we're looking pretty good because we are saying there's a default plan, and it means that we don't look as disorganized as an internet community as we might. It's completely voluntary. Again, you set your own schedule. Let's talk about the preparation phase. And I think we're here now, folks. I think we really are. It would be nice if you note the IETF should, must, may language. I think it's BCP 9, though Mr. Bradner will correct me. I'm using terms like should, must, and may to say in order to be compliant with this draft, not because you have to do it, but you want to be compliant, you have to do it. Service providers should offer pilot IPv6 internet service to their internet customers. Organizations should arrange for IPv6-based internet connectivity for internet-facing servers, web, email, and DNS. If you've got public servers in this phase, it would be nice to get them connected by a v6. The reason that's kind of important is that at some point, someone's going to get connected and they're going to be accessing you through some dynamic translation box, and to the extent that your traffic is v6 to your website, it'll be native, and to the extent that your website's v4, you're going to be occupying state in someone's translation device somewhere. The more of the internet that we get the most visible public sites connected via v6, the easier this whole thing is. You may provide IPv6 connectivity to internal user communities. I've had people say, I may never transition internally. Yeah, what does it matter? This is talking about intranet expectations. This isn't talking about your private network. This is not talking about what's behind your firewall, because quite frankly, that's your business too. This is getting your expectations lined up with other parties as part of the internet. Transition. We're going to get to a state where it's going to be pretty important to offer v6 connectivity. And you're going to have v6 connectivity, because if you don't enter a phase where you have v6 connectivity, translation boxes may not work forever. They just may not. Even with wonderful dynamic NAT and all the various algorithms and all the nice things that people are working on to let v4 hosts try to talk to v6, that doesn't scale. And so at some point, we're going to have to treat v6 as production. Internet-facing servers are going to have to be treated as production. You're going to have to receive a call. You're going to have your NOC be able to open a ticket. It would be nice if you provided internal connectivity. Why? Because your users may start accessing resources which may only show up on v6. And if you don't offer v6 internally eventually, that'll be a problem. Post-transition. We're going to get to the state where the internet is considered to be more v6 than v4. No one knows when this situation is. If you believe that we can extend v4's lifetime a little while, and we can make translations work, and we can do a bunch of dynamic NAT, this could be 10 years before this happens. If you don't believe in those circumstances, this may have to happen a lot sooner in order for us to have full connectivity. Not rocket science. Let's talk about timelines. This draft has some dates. It says we're in preparation phase till January 2010. That was a long time, actually, when I first started writing this. It's now conveniently right around the corner. It's about 15 months away. And that means you've got 15 months you probably should get your mail and web servers at least connected via v6. That decreases the load on everyone else. It is being a good internet citizen. Transition, January 2010 to December 2011. In that time period, you may have people asking whether you support v6. You may have people expecting, if you do have v6 records, Quad A, if you do have v6 routes, for you to treat them as production. So either pull them out or treat them appropriately. Don't be surprised if we get to a point where someone tries to connect the customer to the internet in a few years from now with only v6 and yells at you because you're not announcing your resources, your website, your DNS, your customer services via v6. That's a post-transition world. There's some other comments in the RFC about use of transition versus native v6. Obviously, we can't run this whole thing with transition mechanisms. You've got to eventually offer v6 services to people via native v6 and not via tunnels and not via dynamic NAT and a few other things. Because it's a short talk, I'll say grab the RFC. Questions? I'm up here once, guys. We've got a lot of talks, but if you're going to ask a question, now's the time. Oh, look. Mr. Dan Golding.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Are you sure you want to claim that regulators and tax authorities are going to come down on people if they do not have a transition plan that is compliant with an IETF RFC, a document with no standing in law at all?
Right. So, for example, the Organization of Economic Cooperative Development, the OECD, 41 democracies around the globe, actually had a meeting and they said, we need to have a plan for transition of the internet. And I found out after the fact that, wow, there's a reference to this RFC in the middle of that document, okay? So I'm not saying it's something that is inevitable to happen. What I'm saying is, if we don't show up with a plan, they will make one, and it's good of us to say there's a default, if nothing else.
I just want to point out the U.S. government had an IPv6 transition drop dead date by this year.
Right.
And of course, that didn't happen either. So while the transition is obviously something we want to work for, and your dates are, I think, very accurate, I think one of the reasons IPv6 transition has been slow is because people have cried wolf so many times over the past 5 years that you have to do it now, and now cynicism has creeped in. So I just think we need to be careful.
Just to be clear, Dan, the OMB 2.5 years ago mandated that by June 30th, all federal agencies would transition one IPv6 packet from within their network to something outside their network. It was done to make sure that all the federal agencies bought equipment that had an IPv6 checkbox. Every agency passed the test. It was actually a huge success, so that we don't have federal agencies a couple of years from now being told to turn on v6 and not having the right equipment. So actually, I like your example, but I call it a success, not a failure.
Well, we can take that offline. It was interpreted to mean that eventually, but we both know when the original announcement was made, the original announcement was that there would be a complete transition by this year, and then there was massive, massive backpedaling.
I was sitting in a House panel when the announcement was made with Curran Evans of OMB beside my shoulder. I might see it differently than you.
That's fine.
Next.
Kevin
Yes.
Overton, ESNet. I was one of the people who was responsible for giving feedback to the OMB on this announcement. And I can assure you that from OMB's perspective and from those reviewing it, it was never, ever looked upon as an IPv6 transition deadline for the federal government. The press seemed to pick it up as one. I was rather stunned when they did that because I went and read the document again. It never said that. It never implied that. It did exactly what the document said. I do believe many people, shall we say, shortcutted things to meet the requirement. I would not call it a 100% success, but it was reasonably close to successful.
Thank you. Okay, Randy.
Randy Bush, IIJ. I was sitting right next to God when she said it was IPv8, and you can touch me afterwards. But look, boys and girls, we're running out of IPv4 space. Get real.
Right. That's it. Any other questions? Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so next speakers are Anton Capella and Alex Pilotov, do we have them in the room?
This is a good update in the last few minutes here. So Alex could not make it. He had some last-minute commitments in New York. He wishes he could be here. So I'll do the talking instead. So I thought. Okay, so the title is perhaps a bit deceptive in itself. There's nothing being stolen more than any other location that would experience a subprefix hijack has anything stolen. The interesting stuff here is going to be talking about more interception. So if I could have retitled the slide and got it to the presenter laptop in time, you would have seen something a bit different. So I'm going to go through a few simple points first before getting into the meat of it, and I'm going to assume that everyone understands basic stuff about BGP and has familiarity with the concept of a subprefix hijack. We're not talking about the details of that. We're talking about the implications of in the interception potentials. So first, we're going to talk about a few points and people who have talked about this and a lot of theory that has been spun, and then talk a little bit about the actual application and mechanics of this particular operation, and then talk about a bit of what we can do to stop it, perhaps ask for more support from the community to continue to push the further development, and then a little bit of an analysis of what we did at DEF CON. And I think that's probably the more interesting piece that folks have requested in this talk. So ultimately, if you hadn't heard yet, this is perhaps a bigger deal than other types of subprefix hijacks in the sense that essentially in a blind scenario with no coordination at either the attacker's network necessarily or definitely the attackee's network, you can attract traffic and bring it right back to that network. And that's, that in itself is not terribly novel, but in the mechanism we'll describe, nothing had been demonstrated to our knowledge of a similar form. The other important point is that to solve these issues requires direct attention. Any providers who are doing adequate filtering now, you're not interesting to this, but the people who are not, and the people who do not have adequate alarming systems in place or interest in generating them are going to be the ones that ultimately help allow the riffraff in, if you will. So prior work, important to cover. So the NIST report from last year essentially just states quite generically, yes, it can be done. We can intercept traffic somehow. No one could say how. The most recent discovery I had made was of a particular paper from Paul Francis at Cornell, and he was using a mechanism that essentially pretended to be, or would have rather been appropriate to do at a tier 2 type network, somebody with several hundred edges. And his paper essentially says that if you swim through AS path alone and do not do subprefix hijacking, you can actually do that successfully, and then also how much edge capacity would you need, or rather how many edges would be required to net significant amounts of traffic. So interesting approach, but not necessarily like this. The next most near match to this kind of a topic was one from UIUC, and this one was discussing essentially by positioning oneself or finding a network that is ideally positioned, what could be done using essentially traffic engineering techniques to both intercept the traffic and re-deliver it to the intended destination. So interestingly, none of these discussed creation of a path, what we will call in this presentation to be a feasible path back to the target. again, we're not talking about, and I don't want to discuss the particulars. I mean, getting a route out there is plain and simple. IRR updates aren't secured. There's a lack of trust from the top down. We all know that. The interesting stuff here is that we can create these selective black holes through typical techniques we've all been aware of, and facilitate some interesting interception potential at a large scale, and from essentially any location to any location. The other points we'll discuss, and the other thing that's perhaps half novel, partially novel about this, is that by applying TTL additions to packets in flight, the entire topology, the layer 3 topology, the data plane topology, is effectively invisible to points that are trying to probe, perhaps traceroute, and tools like that. As far as hiding the hijacker, if the origin route contains an AS path naming ASs of known monitoring ASNs, and if those said monitoring ASNs are employing standard BGP path logic, they would not accept these routes with AS paths that name them because of loop detection as well. So if we knew of the dozen or handful sites that we're monitoring and setting alarms, they perhaps would be thwarted through this technique by including them in the path. We'll talk a bit more about how that might be applicable. So what is the concept at large? What is really happening? So to successfully intercept data, you have to both bring it in and then, again, pass it back somewhere. And the interest here is in getting it back and then not breaking things. So we have to create this path. The question is how. And the papers discussed prior had techniques for this, and some of them were, shall we say, non-trivial. There was work required or coordination required. This one doesn't require that. So how do you create this path back? Well, first, figure out what the path from you, the in-place forwarding path from your network, from the attacker's vantage point, towards a particular target is. Do you forward through any particular upstreams? If so, of course you do. If so, then track what they are. If you forward to upstream A, then to B, then to C, note this. You're going to need to maintain that. And I'll diagram that in a short moment. Again, the ASNs are what we need to know about. If you transit through Sprint to perhaps peer of Sprint to the end user, those are going to be the ASs that we have to eventually black hole to use as our return path. So essentially the point is the in place right now forwarding characteristics must be maintained, or else you don't have a deterministic result. So in the hijacking then, the application of the AS path prepends must include this set of ASNs that you already see back to the target. And again, these are going to be the maintained in-place forwarding elements. Now, once the traffic is arriving, once the hijacked route has been sent, we need to then take the packets that had been received for that particular target prefix, and again shoot them down this feasible path. So a U-turn, if you will, a hairpin, has to occur in our attacker's ASN. And then after we do all that, we go upstairs. So how does this look normally? Let's watch a route propagate from the target ASN 200. They're going to originate a /22. And we see that route propagate, layer by layer, degree by degree. Eventually the attacker hears that route and says, aha, they have a 22. The forwarding table that would be resulting from this would look as such. Now, the interesting thing we have to maintain here is, the path we've currently selected. We want to continue to use 10 and 20 to reach 200. So if this 22 is going to be subject to a subprefix hijack, say a 24, we would observe that viable path and continue to want to use it. We would then build an AS path list, or rather a prepend rather, to attach to this /24. And so when that 24 is announced, perhaps the font's too small to see, it would be appending to the right of 100, 10, 20, and 200. So what this would effectively do is prevent AS20 from learning that route via 30 or anybody else they're adjacent to, and also prevents 10 from learning it from us. You can kind of let 30 and 40 in your minds represent the other 30,000 some ASNs out there. 10 and 20 could be neighbored up to every single one, and if their AS number again is in the path, That's going to fail checks unless they've disabled that check. So we announce route, said route goes out, and the forwarding path that we now observe, the forwarding table we now observe in all the coordinated routers is what we desired. We wanted 30 and wanted 40 and wanted the rest of the internet to send traffic for that 24. Again, longer prefix already won that to us, but now because 10 and 20 have not accepted our route, all they have in place in 10 and 20 is our /22, as learned from 200. Therefore, they continue to forward this back to 200. And this is the essence of the BGP man in the middle. This perhaps was the part that was not well represented by previous reports and news articles and things online. So again, the traffic can U-turn through us, and we don't break things. We miss, of course, traffic from 10 and 20. So if those were exceptionally large ASs or customers of those who weren't singly homed, or rather who were singly homed, we wouldn't get that traffic. The attacker in ASN 100 would only see traffic minus the feasible path back to the target ASN 200 here. So once the traffic gets to us, of course, to facilitate the U-turn, toss a static route in. So at DEF CON, as a small summary, the timestamp in epic seconds at the start of the hijack was 252 ASs reporting the /22 at the conferences network. And within 80 seconds, 94% of them carried the hijack 24. And the difference, could be a policy issue, could be customers who were somehow singly homed or somehow not getting the hijacked route from a feasible path that we had used. Not sure. Interestingly enough, it was somewhat successful in this particular metric. Everyone likes graphs. I like academics too, so I decided to get one of the time series. This one will show on the right x-axis the number of ASs reporting having heard the 24 at a certain timestamp. The delta from origin first heard, rather from the first heard announcement, is in seconds across the bottom, and the leftmost axis is the accumulation on the green line of ASs that have been ASs that would have been heard, percentage of total that would have been taking the route, and you can kind of see evidence of MRAI having done its job. So again, when the route's announced, it's fairly quick. We all know that, but if you're near the core, you can insert the hijack route quickly, and it doesn't disrupt things. Again, as the route propagates from the point of view of the attacker, everyone's forwarding to you as each degree transfers the route successively. So essentially, the attacker can insert themselves into the inbound path of a particular prefix and not disturb anything, which is unexpected in my mind. You definitely will see, and we did observe at DEF CON, that when the route was removed or withdrawn, microloops would cause momentary outages for the next number of minutes until things converged back towards the original origin. So essentially that method then means we have, I think, yet one more reason than just observing outages like YouTube last February to look and to re-examine ways to solve or ways to perhaps pin trust on the apparent origin of a particular prefix. And I think ultimately this means we need to step it up. We haven't done this in 10 years. I don't want to get up here in the next 10 and still see similar issues. I'd like to have this solved. I guess, of course, we heard a discussion about securing the root prior, and I'd like to hear something similar, more about securing things from the point of view of RIRs. So perhaps the half novel portion will be interesting to talk about. The way that we did this at DEF CON was of course to attract the traffic, but that wasn't cool enough because it reveals a long trace route without doing anything about it. So essentially, Alex's network originated the /24, and from the point of view of a router on a Chicago transit link to AT&T was taking a detour, of course, into Savvis, then to New York, then to Pilosoft, and then the static route back out was through N-Layer towards Limelight and towards then Switchcom. by adding values to TTL upon ingress, you can then effectively hide all of that. And this is a trivial thing with IP tables. It's an increment command. Add some number to it. All of a sudden, trace routes don't reveal you. So with an adjustment, the hijacked route is 13 hops. You could have made that arbitrarily short. Could have been 10, whatever. Could have hidden all of the ingress paths to Switchcom group. But again, the original went from AT&T to Limelight. The hijack now goes from AT&T to Savvis to Switchcom. And there are no observed edges anywhere on the internet between Savvis and Switchcom, behind Savvis that is, but to anyone doing a trace route, this isn't obvious. You'd have to have a view somewhere. Ideally, someone looking at things to secure things would do more than just look for subprefix hijacks or subprefix origin changes, but also something that would look at perhaps a tomography or a topology approach to pinning down the intersection of does that edge that we see or we elicit really exist in routing. Could be open to a lot of interesting, perhaps, research. So the default way to originate a prefix, of course, would reveal your, or rather the attacker's, origin AS in the path. A friend had turned me on to the point that devices that support transparent AS, or rather software daemons such as OpenBGPD, Quagga, can send routes with any apparent origin AS. And if your neighbor's not enforcing next AS, on the neighbor session, they'll accept this prefix, they'll accept this advertisement without any troubles. So perhaps the attacker could even be completely opaque in the origin of this subprefix. If you had perhaps a session to your transit configured as reflector client or route server client, as you went at, say, an MPLA style route server based exchange. So this opens up yet one more avenue for being somewhat stealth. Again, this will not make any sense from what a real relationship would reveal if you could examine the actual data plane at each particular adjacency. And again, this could be an avenue for detection as well. So, shorter talk than perhaps we had planned. I think we have time for some questions, certainly. But I guess all I wanted to summarize by saying was that this is pretty stealth, can be nearly invisible, yet you'll still see some disturbances from the point of view of a subprefix hijack. If we consider some of the papers, especially the one from Cornell, we know that we don't even need to win with subprefixes. If a certain network were co-opted, this could be done without subprefix hijacks required. Subprefix wouldn't even matter. We would just win through edges. And if you won the right edges for whatever the purpose was, then the need is served. We know that, again, path isn't going to be the only telltale, but it could be massaged. So we can't depend on that alone to perhaps detect it. So I think this points to a combination of mechanisms required to adequately protect this or alarm on it. And bottom line, filter your customers, turn on NextAS. It's on an iOS by default. It's probably good to turn it on if it's not, older software. And that's all. Any questions? Ivan, Randy? All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, we're back to IPv6 again. And we have Håkon Ringberg from Princeton talking on some work he's done with Danny McPherson.
Hi everyone, I'm Håkon Ringberg. I'm a PhD student at Princeton University, where I work with Jennifer Rexford. This work is not with Jennifer Rexford, though. It's work I did while I was an intern at Arbor Networks this past summer. And my collaborators are listed on the slide, Craig, Danny, and Scott. So as the title suggests, this is yet another IPv6 talk. I'm sure you're thrilled. We, however, looked at traffic data, and I think a lot of people up until this point have had only indirect estimates of the amount of IPv6 traffic on the internet. So I hope first to put this talk into a bigger context from Arbor's perspective, a bigger measurement push that Arbor is going through right now. Then I will talk about why you might care. I'll repeat why you might care about an IPv6 measurement talk, introduce our methodology, the key results, and then to preempt some possible objections. We got some feedback, mostly very positive, but some complaints with the methodology. So I'll go over some potential weaknesses with the methodology. So if you're itching when I present the methodology to complain, you're of course welcome to scream at me, but I might cover it later. So like I said, what we wanted to do is provide a global and longitudinal perspective on the amount of IPv6 traffic that we observed in the internet. And this really is part of a bigger push at Arbor to leverage their deployments, the probes that they have in the field, to provide a perspective on all of internet traffic. Sort of on the one hand, any kind of traffic, where is it going, what services, applications, and what's the rate of growth, and on the other hand, the pervasiveness of certain specific types of unwanted traffic, such as DDoS attacks. So they want to leverage their, I guess, approaching 3,000 deployments now, and have networks participate in this voluntarily to share anonymized data with Arbor. So, like I said, again, it's voluntarily participating ISPs. They share some anonymized data. Here you have, in this little diagram, toy diagram, 3 networks that have bought Arbor gear, perhaps Peakflow or something, and they send data then back to the mothership for Arbor to analyze, perhaps in an offline setting such as this, or in real time. These networks categorize themselves according to their type and their predominant geographic coverage. The data set, what we get is traffic in and out of a network, binned into 5-minute samples, the top protocols, ports, the ASNs where traffic is coming from and going to from the given network's perspective. And it's largely based on IP flow measurements as opposed to DPI. And it has, we've had this thing going for, I guess, 2 or 3 years, but for today, we're doing a 1-year measurement period. This slide is mainly to impress you. It's a little old. I guess the high-level message is that there are 65 networks in the Americas, 27 in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and 6 in Asia. And at the end of our measurement period, we had a daily average of that exceeded 5 terabits per second of internet interdomain traffic in this data set. So we believe it's the largest of its kind. So now I've given you the sort of big lay of the land and sort of the measurement push. More specifically, repeating why might people care about the IPv6? Well, we're running out of addresses, or more specifically, the IANA and the RARs are running out of unallocated address space. The exact date when the internet will implode or explode, there is some uncertainty about. But I guess it's within the next few years. 18 months was mentioned. Luckily for all of us, IPv6 fixes all our ails. It has something on the order of 28 orders of magnitude more addresses, so that should be sufficient for a couple of years. And because we have this big problem and there is an available solution, there's been some government pressure in various parts of the world for us to make this transition. The OMB in the US mandated that IPv6 be available on routers. And in China, there's the Next Generation Internet Initiative, which, among other things, pushes for IPv6 adoption. Okay, so we have this problem, this solution, and people are pushing for us to make the transition. How's that going for you all? And ideally what we want, the direct measure, is an understanding of the amount of IPv6 traffic that is on the internet. Unfortunately, as people have mentioned today, and I can certainly attest to as an academic, it's really hard to get network operators to just share all their traffic data with you for various largely understandable reasons. Therefore, we have primarily indirect estimates of how much IPv6 traffic there is on the internet. So this is sort of the related work and was talked about earlier. 3% is the fraction of ASNs with IPv6 BGP announcements. That's a fairly small number, but it's larger than 1%, which is the fraction of Internet 2 sites with a passing IPv6 grade. A little disappointing. One might expect them to be ahead of the curve, or maybe they are. Even more disappointing is that 0.4% of the biggest websites, according to some methodology, are using IPv6. And finally, as you may predict, there's an even lower number, which is 0.2%, which is the IPv6 DNS queries as a fraction of the IPv4 DNS load. So we've got very small numbers here. There's an order of magnitude difference between the smallest and the largest, but they're all small. So our contribution is to provide another number to this, but one that is that directly states from our 5 terabits per second of average daily throughput traffic trace, the fraction of IPv6 in that trace was it was between 0.02 and 0.003%. So that I think you will agree is very small. So now I've told you the final number and the broad methodology. So a little more specifically, what is IPv6 internet traffic in our case? Well, I told you what traffic is. That's largely from flow-based measurements. By internet, we mean interdomain. So this is traffic in our trace that crossed an AS boundary. And for IPv6, we wanted to cover both native and we wanted to look at the two primary forms of tunnel traffic. For the native, it requires, for us to be able to monitor it, the router has to have NetFlow v9. We have, of the two forms of tunneled, we have IPv4 protocol 41 tunnel traffic, and then Teredo traffic, which is tunneled over UDP port 3544. Here's another graph primarily meant to blow you away. This is the total traffic that we observed in our data set. So approaching 5 terabits per second. In this graph on the bottom, you have time, roughly end of July 2007 until end of July 2008. On the y-axis, you have throughput in terabits per second daily average. The bottom blue is the Americas. You have Europe, Middle East, and then Asia at the top. So it's a lot of traffic. Hopefully, a representative sample of internet traffic. So first, the denominator, the good news. IPv6 traffic is growing. On the bottom here, you have again time on the x-axis. The y-axis is megabits per second of IPv6 traffic. The blue is tunneled IPv4 protocol 41. The green is native. You're not blind. There is no green. The red is Teredo at the top, the little thin layer there. The good news is that we see, if you take the first quarter and the final quarter of our measurement period, we see a 30% increase. And it's approaching 150 megabits at the end of our measurement period. So that's the good news. 150 megabits, can sound like a kind of impressive number, but of course it's not all that impressive when compared to 5 terabits. And again, you have here in the graph time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, there's the percent bits per second of IPv6 as a function of the total traffic that we saw in our data set. This is not 0 to 4%. It is 0 to 4 when scaled by a factor of 10 to the negative 5. So that 3 there is 3 thousandths of 1% IPv6 traffic. I think you will agree that is very small. And the other thing is, while there is increase in our data set of the amount of IPv6 traffic that we observed, it is in fact growing slightly slower than overall internet traffic. So when compared to overall traffic, it's actually stagnant. And that pretty much are the results for my talk. We went looking in our giant data set for IPv6 traffic, and we didn't really find much. But we have this. We released a tech report, a month or two ago, and this slide isn't. I didn't even make this graph. This was generously donated by the kind folks at Hurricane Electric. It just demonstrates that our report had an immediate, profound impact on industry. On the x-axis of this graph, you have time. On the y-axis, you have tunnel broker account signups for Hurricane Electric. So right when we released our report, there was a doubling in the amount of people signing up. The good news, I guess. So potential objections to the methodology. So the one that we heard a couple of times is that we weren't monitoring your network. I guess the corporate perspective there is that's super. Please call Arbor today, and they would be happy to sell you boxes and include you in the measurement study. The slightly more scientific response is that at 5 terabits per second, it's certainly the largest study today that I'm aware of, and hopefully you believe that it's representative. There is a North American, also on the sort of selection of networks, there's a North American European bias. There was about a 1 terabits per second at the end of traffic from Asia, but yes, there was a North American European bias. We also focused on interdomain traffic. Some people have been saying that there is more IPv6 intradomain. That is something we have access to that data for the networks in question. So we hope to look at that in future work. And also for future work, again, this data set is flow-based. Primarily, we also hope to do a measurement study based on DPI data. Perhaps IPv6 traffic is hiding in other ports. Then final slide of the objections. It's possible we're undercounting native IPv6 traffic. Like I said, for us to measure it, monitor it, the router needs to have v9, and it seems that v5 is the flavor of choice. On the one hand, I can punt on this and say, hey, that's not my fault. The router, the network operators need to make this transition. The other point is that someone somewhere made the determination that it wasn't necessary to do this upgrade to perform this monitoring, and so one can read things into that. It's also possible that we're undercounting Teredo traffic because my understanding of the protocol is that the realize and servers listen on 3544, but subsequent data traffic need not. We looked into this a little further. Scott looked into it a little further and found that, there are only 2 of our 100 deployments that saw more than occasional few kilobits per second of traffic on this port. So there wasn't a lot of relay and server traffic. So if we're undercounting it, we're probably not undercounting it by much. And as you may recall, the Teredo was just a very thin line up there. So even if you multiply it by a factor of 10, it's not going to change the fact that 0.003% of traffic is IPv6 in our data set. Okay, so to conclude quickly, we took a look in our data set. We found some IPv6 traffic, very little. There is some growth, but not compared to overall internet traffic. So largely negative news, I suppose. My talk is mainly a measurement talk, deliberately dry and boring, but perhaps, and other people have much more eloquently argued for why there has been this sort of lack of a transition. But very quickly, From a lot of networks perspective, transitioning to IPv6 represents probably a net outflux of money, at least for now. There's a cost associated with the hardware-software transition upgrades, but not clear that there's any added revenue. It's also a chicken and egg problem, like people have pointed out. There are no users, so content providers don't feel a need to upgrade, and there's no content, so users don't feel a need to upgrade. We haven't had that killer IPv6 app, except for the dancing turtle. And then it's perhaps understandable, a lot of people have the opinion, at least from my perspective right now, IPv4 is working well. Why should I mess with my network? So then I'm going to end, let you go to lunch early, and I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Jay Hennigan with Impulse Internet Services in Santa Barbara. As far as IPv6 content, it seems to me that one of the things that is preventing this is the large number of broken IPv6 implementations out in customer space. And that if, for example, I know that Google has IPv6.google.com, which works very well. But my understanding is that if a number of websites, if they were to put a quad A record for example, www.google.com, that people who are running an IPv6 stack that don't have IPv6 connectivity would break. And so the problem is that I don't know how to resolve that, but that to me seems to be a major stumbling block for getting IPv6 content out there. It has to be made somehow transparent to the users so that they essentially go to the same site and it just works. So I think that the customer space needs to have some major upgrades so that if they get a quad A record and they don't have IPv6 connectivity, that it will relatively quickly and seamlessly fall back to v4.
I completely agree, and I suspect it's probably one of several major stumbling blocks. Please.
Alain Durand, could you please go back to your Teredo slide?
Stop me.
Doesn't matter. You're counting the traffic on the well-known UDP port number.
Yes.
So what you're doing is you are counting the signaling traffic to Teredo. You are not counting the data traffic.
Right.
So the data traffic is several order of magnitude larger than the signaling traffic. So
right.
what you are measuring is actually irrelevant to Teredo.
Right. So
that's actually where the action is right now. There are some peer-to-peer applications that are in that space, that you are not counting.
Right. So you agree that the relays and servers have to they synchronize on this port.
That's only the first packet.
Right. So even if we multiply that by 2 orders of magnitude,
well, it doesn't mean anything. The signaling and the data are completely unrelated.
Okay.
So if you do not measure the data path, you do not measure anything.
Okay. So that's a need for DPI measurements, certainly. I guess I would, sure, that DPI measurements are necessary.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm Martin Levy from Hurricane. Could you go to the penultimate slide, your conclusions?
Certainly.
And stop. I wanted to know what packet filtering you used in order to understand the money, high cost, no added revenue part. Where were you filtering to understand the revenue aspect of V6?
I mean, this is, I don't understand. There was no, I don't understand the question.
Okay, I just wondered why there was revenue in that because nothing from what you said had anything to do with revenue up to this point. Okay, traffic on AMS-IX, 0.1% at the moment, sitting as V6.
Mm-hmm.
Major difference from what you're seeing on your numbers. You're down in the
what transits?
So that's just on the AMS-IX exchange in Amsterdam. Second question is, on all of the networks that you measured for this data,
right.
Did you have any of the major V6 backbones within your measuring set?
I can't answer that off the top of my head. I mean, there are other measurements out there, and I don't know their methodology when compared to ours, so it's impossible for me to answer.
Okay, so does that mean that there's a measure of what's your confidence factor on this number?
I am completely confident that this answer represents the fraction of IPv6 as in our data set of a 5 terabits per second data set.
Okay.
Hello. Patrick Elmer.
Please.
Partner, the 400 megs on AM6 is actually almost all news peering from a single provider. I don't think it's representative of the whole internet since they only offer it over the AM6. That's the only place you can get it. And if you turn that news peering off, it drops by at least 2 orders of magnitude. So the AM6 thing is a little off. That doesn't mean that there's not more traffic in general. I'm just saying that AM6 is a bad data point to say that this data set presented in the slides is wrong.
Thank you.
Randy Bush, IIJ, we're arguing over how powerful a microscope you need to see the V6 traffic. All of the microscopes are pretty broken. I do internet measurement. It sucks when some serious computer scientists are measuring your product as a behavioral phenomenon. You are in trouble. And it's a turtle and egg problem, not a chicken and egg problem.
Jeff Houston, I must admit, this whole issue of exactly what you're measuring and what does it mean really becomes a problem. I looked at this same thing about traffic, and the problem with a lot of the traffic we actually see on the network is heavy tail distribution. There's an astonishing amount of large traffic flows where the volume is high but the number is low, and an awful lot of folk with very short traffic flows where the volume is extremely low per flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you mean when you say, I've looked at traffic, versus what does it mean to say an industry is making its steps towards migration? And part of the reason, I suppose, why I, in looking at what was happening at a web server, really didn't bother about trying to look really hard about the amount of traffic, was that I'm not sure I understood what I was measuring when I was getting my microscope out to look at the packets. It just didn't seem to make much sense in terms of what's the real question I'm trying to answer.
So absolutely, and I mean, I didn't mean I didn't mean at all to say that the related work was not very useful, and I think each of the different metrics that you choose to measure will have weaknesses, and are useful for some things.
Normally, just to wrap this, you've looked at 5 months.
What's that?
You've looked at 5 months here, September through to December.
It's a year.
So what was it like a year before, and the year before, and the year after? Some ways, when you actually don't know what you're measuring in reality, as long as you keep on doing it, the comparison between what happened before and what happens in the future then becomes the interesting bit. It's the first order differential that then becomes, the actual metric you're after. That seems amazingly flat, but that's an amazingly short sample.
A year?
In this kind of world, yes, we move very slowly, evidently.
Please.
Hi, Elisa from M6. I just want to add to the previous discussion that we measure native IPv6 traffic based on SFlow data we have, and it was true indeed that it was in the beginning caused by basically one provider who enabled new services over V6. And that is not true anymore, at least from what I can see in the growth that happened. I mean, we do about 600-800 megs, I believe, and 200 of them were this first provider who enabled it half a year ago. Thanks.
Okay, is that all questions? Okay, thank you, Hakon. Oh, wait a minute, one more from Randy.
Talk is cheap. How many providers here, Randy Bush, IIJ, sorry. How many providers here have public SMTP servers that are accessible over IPv6. Web servers, DNS servers. Okay, could some researcher actually take this measurement, not by raised hands, by actually doing something like taking an analog list, going to their side, and find out, through all this BS, are we as a community actually deploying IPv6? Are there going to be more turtles than eggs? You know?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're ahead, so we have one more question from John.
So, John Curran, I'll put my ARIN hat on, make it really clear. Chairman of ARIN. We don't have to deploy IPv6. If you don't need more addresses, when the central RIRs run out, when the central red pool runs out, and then the RIRs run out, there may be some reclaimed. You're all going to mine your own infrastructure. You may go back to customers and say, hey, I really want the other half back because you're not routing it and I need it. There'll be some soft places you can recover. But you don't need to deploy v6 unless you're relying on the fact that you continually need new addresses to connect new customers. That doesn't apply to everyone in the room, but it does apply to some folks, and they're aggressively deploying v6.
Okay, well, before we quit for lunch, I have one thing to remind you of, which is to please vote, if you haven't already done so, in the steering committee elections. You have 28 minutes before the voting closes at 1 p.m., so it'd be nice to see more votes. And, of course, don't forget to complete the survey before you leave. There's plenty of them lying around, or you can do it online. Okay, it's lunch on your own now. We restart at 2:30.
I am sending out acceptances